last time we kind of had to treat Anselm's satisfaction theory in a cursory manner. But don't worry, we're leaving the clowns aside. We're going to get back to the serious stuff. We talked about whether or not we would be convinced by his methodology of arguing, but even if you set that aside and just asked, well, what are the merits of his theory, the best way to see that is to compare it with other options. So when we talk about Christ's atoning work on the cross for us, what exactly happened? We're going to lay some of those out, and in doing so, we'll be able to come back to Anselm's theory and see if we don't have a better understanding of what he is and is not saying. Now, in reviewing these alternative theories, I should warn you that I'm going to move quickly, and so I won't do justice to any one of them. But I hope by seeing them in comparison, we can see some of the strengths and weaknesses. So let me jump right in with the first one. And I only list 3 major theories, even though there are other ways to sort of break these down into subcategories, or there's different ways to list them, but I think this is the most straightforward. So the first one that I talk about is ransom theory. And this is often said to be the view held by those in the early church, and that's in a way very true. You'll find this in places like Gregory Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, Augustine. But it shows up in all sorts of different imaginative ways. So the main idea is that Christ has redeemed us, ransomed us. Well, from who or what? And the answers are things like Satan, sin, death, hell. And so how does Christ ransom us is the next question, and he does so by being victorious over these things. So therefore, while some people want to separate these 2 theories altogether, I think the idea of Christ as Christus Victor is simply describing the work he does in the ransom theory. Who is Christ, and how does he ransom us? So as I said, this is often done in a very imaginative ways. You can find sermons where death and hell are imagined to be the Leviathan of old, that sea monster that tries to swallow up all humanity. And God's plan to rescue that humanity swallowed up in the belly of the beast is to lower down Christ as if he were bait on a fishing hook. Because since death, hell, Leviathan swallows up humans, God the Son coming in the form of a human was easy bait. But that's hiding the divinity within Christ, which is used to catch, kill, destroy Leviathan, Satan, sin, death, hell, etc. So Christ is victorious over all those things. He frees us and rescues us from all those things. Now, there is a critique here. First, there is a sort of theological problem. I mean, you've set it up as if Satan, sin, death, hell has its own sphere of power apart from God. Is there some sort of dualism and yin and yang at work? And the criticism is, of course, no, that God is all-powerful. And who gave Satan dominion over those sinners? Who gave power to sin, Satan, death, and hell? And the answer is God is all-powerful. So the question is, why couldn't God just snap his fingers and free us? And the second problem is not just that theological dualism, but there is the question of God's character. It makes God look a little sneaky, a little less than honest. Why did he have to hide Jesus's divinity? Why did he sneak Jesus in as a human? And so with those sorts of questions, this is probably not a complete theory of the atonement. But that brings us to our second theory. All right, the second theory of the atonement we could talk about is the moral theory of the atonement. And this wants to critique the first one and say, look, God doesn't need to have a battle with Satan or death. God doesn't need a blood sacrifice or anything like that. God could just snap his fingers and save us. And if that's the case, then what is Jesus doing? I think a good way to understand this is to take the question that Peter once asked of Jesus. Peter asked Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive my brother? 7 times? And the answer, of course, is no, not 7 times, 70 times 7. And if you do the math, that just comes up to 490. But Jesus is clearly not saying that at the 491st time, then you can judge your brother and stop forgiving your brother. The answer Jesus gives to Peter is you should forgive and forgive and forgive until it hurts. So now, with that in mind, the moral exemplar theory sort of asks this question: why doesn't God play by God's own rules? Why does God need a sacrifice? Why does God need a price to be paid? And the answer, according to this theory, is God does not. God doesn't need all of those things or require them. That's not what Jesus was sent to do. Jesus was sent to be our example. Christus exemplus. Christ is the ultimate example for us in following God. And if you live a life where you do what Jesus said, where you just forgive and forgive and forgive, and you love and you love and you love, you're going to do that till it hurts. You're going to rub people the wrong way, and it'll probably get you killed. Just ask Gandhi, just ask Martin Luther King, and just ask Jesus. Now, the criticism of this model is one, it doesn't really seem to have Jesus do anything. It doesn't ever seem to have God do anything. Where is God's action in this? Now, yes, God sends Jesus to teach us, to show us, to live an example, but does God never set right the wrongs? I mean, if an axe murderer were going from house to house to house, and no one ever stopped them, no one ever brought about justice and ended this, it wouldn't seem that the person was very just at all. So why is it that there is no sense of God's justice in this model? And the other criticism of this that's probably more serious is one that Augustine raised long ago, because Augustine encountered a version of this in Pelagius, and Augustine points out that Pelagius's model doesn't even need Jesus. Christ becomes unnecessary in a moral exemplar model, because Augustine asks, why do we need to follow Jesus' example of trusting God no matter what? Why don't we just follow Abel? Abel trusted God no matter what, even unto death. And maybe Abel would be the perfect example to trust God and then see that God will raise us even in death. And sure, Jesus was a good example, and we could probably think of others, but is Jesus necessary? So with that critique, then the moral exemplar still has its own problems. That brings us to our third theory. Now, the third theory is Anselm's theory. And in the first video, I gave a very short version of that, where I talked about how man, or humanity, owes an infinite amount to God, because God is of infinite worth. And yet, only God could pay that. But it wouldn't be fitting, it wouldn't be appropriate, it wouldn't be justice for God to pay something that someone else owed. So we have a debt that only God can pay, but it's a debt that only man owes. And the solution is the God-man, Cur Deus Homo, why God became man. But I want to take the theory a little more in depth now, because what Anselm is really doing with thinking about satisfying God, what is owed to God, is he sees this as us satisfying, or Jesus satisfying, two things. Now, you might be tempted to say one of them is wrath. And if you did, you would be technically correct. But it would be more complete to say that you're satisfying God's judgment, and the second thing is God's honor. And I pause to talk about wrath because one of the major critiques of this theory is that this sets up this wrathful God. And it sets up this God who's only concerned with blood, thirst, and sacrifice. And until God's wrath is assuaged, then he can't forgive us or love us. Well, if you saw from last class's video, we went out of our way to show how Anselm is certain that God is eternally, always, forever showering down love and grace, immutably so. This doesn't quite fit with what Anselm says. In fact, if you read through Anselm's entire work, you'll see that he almost never even says the word wrath. And every time it does, if best I can tell, it's Bozo who's asking about God's wrath, not Anselm. So this is not Anselm setting up God as some sort of cosmic child abuser, but the opposite. He goes out of his way to draw on the Chalcedonian definition to explain how in Jesus, God himself has come to us. And yes, it looks like he's sacrificing his son or himself, but even then, Bozo raises those objections. And the answer that Anselm clearly has is that God came to offer himself to us, and yet humans killed God. God doesn't demand a sacrifice. But even amidst all of that, if we set those sort of what I think are misreadings aside, we do have to acknowledge that he's dealing with judgment and honor. And judgment we sort of get. Judgment is justice, the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a life is taken, a life is owed. But then honor is something different, because Anselm is actually coming from a culture that who are mostly not in an honor-shame culture, we don't quite understand. So I need to take a moment and explain further how his view of satisfaction satisfies God's honor. Okay, I mentioned how we understand justice, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But honor is different when you're living in Anselm's context, because he's writing from feudalistic Europe. So let me explain how this would work in this system. If I steal a loaf of bread from you, what justice requires is that I pay you back a loaf of bread. But what honor requires, I have dishonored you, so I need to, maybe apologize. At least that would be the case if I'm a peasant and you're a peasant, because our honor is of equal worth. But now this is different if I steal a loaf of bread from you and I'm a peasant and you are a member of the nobility. Because now I owe you a loaf of bread. Justice demands it. But your honor is so much more than my honor that I'm going to have to owe you a lot more than a simple apology. I'll probably be locked in the stocks for days and have people throw rotten fruit at me to publicly shame me for what I did to dishonor you. Now, if we take it to the next level, if I steal a loaf of bread from you and I am a lowly peasant and you are the king or the queen of the land, now your honor is of so much more worth that I owe you not just a loaf of bread, justice is still the same, but your honor probably means I owe you my life, and probably my life should be paid in a slow, painful death. Now, since we don't think in those terms today, it's very easy to dismiss Anselm's model of the atonement. And I want to come back and get to that idea of honor in a moment. But what I need to do next, before we do that, is to show how people who don't quite buy Anselm's view of God, of honor, especially this feudalistic ranking of honor, if you don't accept that, then how do you accommodate his model of the atonement? Now, I said I was only going to list 3 theories of the atonement, but there are other theories, and I list these separately because I think these are derivative theories. The main one is the one that you'll find in John Calvin in the Protestant Reformation, and he has this idea of substitutionary atonement or penal substitution, because the penalty must be paid by someone, even if there's a substitute who pays it. And in this way of thinking, what I believe has happened is that Calvin has taken Anselm's model of satisfaction, but he's shifted it from that feudalistic Europe to a more later and modern view, where we no longer have kings who have different systems of honor than the rest of us, but we still do have civic officials, magistrates, judges. So when you shift from a king to a judge, and you drop the idea of justice and honor and only talk about justice, you get Calvin's view of penal substitution. And the way this works is that justice requires eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And we owe God our lives. Now, the criticism of this view that's coming up lately is, if this is a courtroom analogy and God is a judge and we are the guilty party, there are some people who are just not sure that this system of justice looks all that just. So famously what you would say is something like this: If I were accused of being a serial murderer and I was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be guilty, and the jury finds me guilty and the judge declares that the death penalty is required, what would happen if then my neighbor, say John, stood up in the court and said, "Hold on, judge, I'm going to pay the price. I'm going to let you give me the death penalty so that my neighbor can go free"? Well, that would be very loving, very Christian, self-sacrificial thing for my neighbor John to do. But would that really be justice? To let a serial killer go free and walk the streets again? And because there are these kinds of questions, there are many who are trying to get rid of this idea of substitutionary atonement, some even within Protestant evangelicalism. So it's causing quite a debate. And what I suspect is happening here is that as our cultural norms and values continue to shift, I think we're floundering about today trying to find how to accommodate Anselm's theory of the atonement in a way that still works. Here's my hunch. In things like constructive theology or even in just practical ministerial experience, I think one of the things that tends to drive us is we think today primarily in terms of economic exchange. And trust me, this sort of monetary analogy has its strengths. I've probably preached this youth sermon myself. If you've led a youth Bible study, you want to get the idea across that God's not just mean and judging, He loves you. And so you use an analogy like this that involves money. With teenagers who are learning to drive, you say something like, "Hey, if you have an accident, you back your car into my car, break my tail light, I still love you. We're cool. We'll still be friends. But somebody's got to pay to fix my tail light." And then you say, "And Jesus paid it all." And that kind of works with taillights. That kind of works with those parts of the relationships. But I'm not sure that really explains things like murder and other capital offenses. So how we're going to go about explaining Anselm's theory of satisfaction or any of these theories today is an open question. And so maybe we should say one more word about the biblical basis for all of these. So in thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these, I think we could admit that virtually every one of these theories and virtually every model that you come across of the atonement has some root in biblical basis. I've heard one New Testament scholar named Scott McKnight explain this to say that the theories of the atonement are kind of like different golf clubs. And sometimes you need a putter, and sometimes you need a driver, and sometimes you need a pitching wedge. But all of these are found in the Bible because we're talking about such a complex, profound thing. We go to our golf bag and we pull out what is needed when we're preaching this part or when we're teaching on this part, and all of these can be helpful ways to talk about the atonement. Now, I think he's on to something there, but if Anselm were here, I think he would push back a little bit. And I think Anselm would claim that yes, all these different theories have a basis in the Bible, but the only one that's a complete theory is his model of satisfaction. He would say that the satisfaction theory of the atonement is the golf bag in which all these other tools fit. Now, you might say, but what's the biblical basis of this? Well, Anselm knows that you don't start by talking about atonement theory and satisfaction. You don't preach this as your first order of discourse. But after you preach a sermon on Christ ransoming us, or Christ is victorious over sin, Satan, death, and hell, when some bozo comes along and says, "Wait a minute, who gave Satan power?" Well, now you're going to need some explanation to answer that legitimate question. You're going to need to say, oh yes, it's true. Satan doesn't have his own realm, his own power. It is God who set up these rules. It is God who said that if you eat of this tree of the fruit, ye shall die. Or if whoever takes man's blood, that one's blood will be required of him. God is the one who set these rules up. And only if you have this broader background theory like satisfaction are you going to be able to answer those kinds of questions. So, what about the part where we said that this is based on a feudalistic model of honor? Well, that is a significant problem, and that's why I say that I think that all these different attempts to accommodate Anselm's view of satisfaction are ways of trying to update him, enculturate him into our view. And I affirm our need to do that. But I would point out that even though we've gotten rid of Anselm's view, his assumption that people have different honors at different ranks in society, we've gotten rid of that because we're very egalitarian and democratic, and every person is of equal worth. But we still say something different when it comes to comparing us and God. I think we would still say that God's honor is worth infinitely more than ours, and God is worth infinitely more honor and praise and things like that. And so while there is a rejection of feudalism when it comes to human society, we still would have to admit to an asymmetrical relationship between God's honor and our honor. So if someone is wanting to preach a passage where Jesus seems to be our moral exemplar, you should preach that passage as good atonement explanation of what Jesus does for us. But then when some bozo comes along and says, what about God's justice? Anselm's theory of satisfaction gives us that broader perspective and that broader theory to be able to talk about what God does. Okay, that about wraps it up for Anselm. I've said before that I think Anselm, especially this text, is probably one of the most important and one of the most misrepresented texts when it comes to the atonement. But here's what is true, is everyone who goes and debates these matters in later Protestantism, all those different theories of atonement, they're all based on the arguments and the sort of foundational assumptions that Anselm sets up for us. And if you go back and watch the other videos where we talked about his work, the Proslogion, what was the most important assumption for Anselm is that all that we do depends on God. Remember when I went to Peter's question and talked about how Peter says, how many times must I forgive my brother? And Jesus says, 70 times 7, which means just keep forgiving and forgiving and forgiving until it hurts. And we asked, why doesn't God play by those rules? Well, for Anselm, the answer is because he's God. He makes the rules. If you go back and look, why is it that we don't take vengeance? Why is it that we don't anymore take eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth? Why is it that we're supposed to love our neighbor, turn the other cheek, and not take vengeance on others? Well, the New Testament is clear. It's because God himself said, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. You see, we can't be depended on to dole out justice well because of our fallen sinful nature. But all of justice depends on God to do it. It's not as if God says there is no justice, and God says that there will never be retribution or there will never be a righting of the wrongs. Instead, we, finite humans, wait and depend on God and his infinite wisdom to bring about this justice. So you see how justice depends on God, not us? And for Anselm, the same is true of salvation. This whole model theory of the atonement is trying to set up the fact that we couldn't save ourselves. It had to be God who did it for us. Even though it's not quite appropriate to say God pays something God doesn't owe, well, Anselm's got a model that can explain how God became man. And even though man owed a debt he could not pay, God paid a debt he did not owe. But he did it as Deus Homo, as the God-man. So this idea of God's grace and our salvation being entirely dependent solely on God's grace, this is what Anselm has really set up to be a clear commitment for Christians that follow after him.
I don't know who Bozo is. What, is he a clown?
What, is he a clown? What, are you kidding me?
Well, what is he?
Yes, he's a clown!
All right, so what's the big deal? There's millions of clowns.